Anyway, thank you for the great introduction, and I will try to speak slowly and clearly, but I think I'm sure looking into this crowd, I'm sure that you will be very well equipped to follow this little introduction to the EFTA and the EEA agreement. First of all, a very warm welcome also from me, both to you online and to you in the room, and happy 30th anniversary with the EEA agreement. Alsis gave you a very brief history of our organization. I'm going to pull you a bit further and then kind of not even a deep dive, but at least a touch into what we're doing. And throughout the day, we really hope that you will leave this house more knowledgeable and even more interested in what we are doing here. So, EFTA is responsible for the management of the EFTA Convention. That is the convention that established us as an organization, and also the convention that regulates the trade between our 4 member states. In reality, since 3 of us also are part of the agreement, it mainly regulates the trade between us and Switzerland. In addition, as was also mentioned, we are responsible for the worldwide network of free trade agreements, basically handled as a secretariat for that, handled in Geneva. And here in Brussels, our really big and main task is to do and facilitate and assist our member states on the well-functioning of the agreement. And I also want to take the opportunity to say a few more words on our statistical office. They are our smallest station, but nevertheless, as Alsis also mentioned, it's a very important one. It's supporting the EFTA member states on its participation in the European Statistical System, ESS. And they are also facilitating, with the very close cooperation with my division, the incorporation of relevant statistical acts into the agreement. They monitor the inclusion of statistics of EFTA states in EES publications, and they provide also outside the EEA with partner organizations, technical assistance to facilitate other organizations also or countries to make good and high quality statistics. And of course, the reason why this is such an important part of our system is that any developments of law and development in societies should be based on facts and figures. So everything really starts with knowing how the world really looks. So they are for sure also helping the well-functioning of and development of the EU internal market that is extended to EFTA through both the agreement and then also bilateral cooperation and agreements between Switzerland and the EU. Then to Brussels and to the EFTA House and to the EFTA Secretariat. What are we doing? Well, first and foremost, we are the Secretariat of the EFTA states in their EEA work, also called the EEA process, or to be even more complicated, the incorporation process, how to make EU law fit into the framework of the EEA agreement. This also means that we have a coordinating role between the EEA states and the European Commission, because the agreement has 2 parties, EEA EFTA states on one side and the EU on the other side. So this cooperation is vital to make the agreement function well. And finally, we are also the Secretariat of the so-called EEA advisory bodies. That means the EFTA Parliamentary Committee and the EFTA Consultative Committee. And my dear colleague, Christoph Sefri, will revert to these bodies when he will tell you a bit more about that later on. So now I will tell you a bit more about why we have the agreement, the objectives and the principles. What is the scope of our cooperation? And what is it supposed to do for the contracting parties? And what not? And finally, say a bit about the setup that we have to ensure that the objectives and the principles are fulfilled. This is the objective of the EEA agreement. So the EEA agreement is establishing a dynamic and homogeneous European economic area based on common rules, equal conditions of competition, and providing for the adequate means of enforcement at the judicial level. Our agreement extends the internal market to the participating EFTA states, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. And it's dynamic in the sense that we incorporate all new and relevant EU legislation. And when it comes to the institutional setup for incorporation of new legislation, that is also a part of this, how to make this as dynamic and swift as possible. When it comes to the setup for the surveillance and judicial litigation, to make it homogeneous, that it not only looks the same, but it's also practiced the same, incorporated the same. You will hear more from that from our excellent colleagues in the EFTA Surveillance Authority and the EFTA Court a bit later this morning. This is my favorite slide. It says everything about what we do in the EFTA House every single day, and it also explains to me very well, at least, what the agreement is all about, what the challenge was, and what it was supposed to do. The agreement is reconciling two very different models of cooperation. On one side, the EU model, on the other side, the EFTA model. On the EU side, we have a supranational cooperation transferring of competence and sovereignty. And quite well known, I think, on the EFTA side, it's an intergovernmental cooperation, and there is no transfer of competence and no common policies. In the EU, they have institutions with defined roles in the decision-making process, being the Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council of where the member states are. On our side, the decisions are taken by consensus between the governments of the EFTA states. An important concern to preserve on the EU side is the decision-making autonomy of the EU. This means that when we're going to make the EU law fit into the agreement, we cannot underestimate the fact that 27 countries have already agreed on something. And the important concern on our side is preserving sovereignty. These are, of course, also well known. One of the reasons why our member states did not want to enter into and become EU members. Okay, something has happened to the colors here, but anyway, the EEA institutional model is a setup commonly referred to as the two-pillar structure. This reflects that the EU cooperation takes place in two quite separate pillars. It's the EFTA pillar and the EU pillar with its institutions. In addition, you have some specific bodies in the middle. The highest governing body of the EEA agreement is the EEA Council. This is where politicians meet to look ahead politically on how they want the agreement and the cooperation to develop. This is where our ministers of foreign affairs meet. They meet twice a year. For the last two fall meetings, it's actually taken place in this room for the very first time in our history, a year and a half ago, and again this fall. Then you have the joint committee, that is the main decision body of the agreement. And you have the standing committee, which is the highest governing body of the EEA EFTA states. They meet 8 times a year. The standing committee the day before the joint committee, where legal acts ready for incorporation is actually decided to be a part of the agreement. And the next meeting is actually in this room next Friday. So this is a special room for the agreements that you are a part of today. Okay, that was a bit about the institutional setup. Then about the substantial scope, because what is this about? What is the substantial part of our cooperation? Well, the core of the agreement is something that is probably known to you, the 4 freedoms. The agreement caters for our full participation and application of the so-called 4 freedoms, which means that there should be no unlawful restrictions to the free movements of goods, services, capitals, and persons within the whole of EEA, meaning the 27 member states and our 3 member states. And to support and make sure that there is a level playing field and that this is not hampered by other forms of unlawful cooperation, we have supporting common rules such as state aid, competition rules, and public procurement. In addition, when they made the agreement, they also realized that there were certain horizontal policies that needed to be there to support this framework and to make it actually work. And examples of those are environment, social policy, consumer protection, statistics that I've also talked a bit about earlier, and company law, to mention some of them. Finally, the agreement also provides for cooperation through EU programs. And this is a quite substantial and important part for us. So basically, we can take active part, or our member states can take active part in the programs, such as in the field of research or education. I think many of you have heard of Erasmus program, for instance. And some of you will have the chance to learn more about the EU programs and the participation and how this has empowered people in the EEA the past 30 years this afternoon, when we have a Icelandic-Norwegian brotherhood through Northcore and Ranis and the Secretariat, and we will offer some useful insights in this cooperation in one of the outbreak sessions. So look forward to that. And finally, I just also want to mention that a part of the agreement is cohesion, where the EFTA states contribute quite substantially to reduce social and economic disparities in Europe. And for that, you will also hear Ragna Fidestøl, the Managing Director of the EEA and Norway grants. She will go into the details on that. Whereas we will go now a bit over to the so-called EEA process, or the incorporation process, the framework for participation and engagement in the EU and with our partners on the EU side. There are two main strands of the EEA work. One is decision shaping, participation in development of EU legislation before EU adoption, and there is decision making, incorporation of an adopted EEA relevant act into the EEA agreement. This might look a bit confusing when you see it just like that. But if I tell you that on the right side is supposed to give a picture of the EU legislation process, on the other side it says a bit about how we as EU members, EEA states can contribute. Because from when we make the law from EU law to EEA law, it's important that we participate at an early stage and that we are engaged not only in the beginning, but throughout the whole process. My excellent colleague Trond will say a bit more about that, but I just wanted to show you this to like a teaser. So basically, from the very beginning, the EEA agreement caters for us to be a part. We can participate in the Commission's work, expert groups and committees. But once the Commission has sent their proposal over to the Council and the Council and the Parliament, we don't have any formal role. It doesn't mean that we don't have other means of participating and influencing and trying to make the EEA law, which later somehow becomes EU law, as good as possible. But that I will leave you to wait excitingly for Trond to say all the juicy details on that, because he is our man when it comes to influencing these processes. I showed you this before, and just to put the EEA process into the two-pillar structure, this is where we are. Of course, in the standing committee, where our EU ambassadors are meeting, they are brilliant people, but they are, of course, not able at all to go into the hundreds of legal acts that we are incorporating into the agreement every year. So behind this structure, there is another secret world, which is basically where the Secretariat has a big role and where the main part of the EEA work and the process is being dealt with. Because under the Standing Committee of the EFTA states, there is another structure. We have 5 subcommittees. Subcommittee 1 to 4 is being taken care of by my division, the Internal Market Division. And all these groups that you see here, they represent EFTA working groups. You would maybe recognize all the titles that are within the substantial scope of the agreement. These groups come to the EFTA House, meet here. We are able to get the Commission come here, explain new regulations. And since we're going to also have our good friends, the Belgian presidency here today, I also want to give great thanks for them, because they have been really willing to come into our working groups, explaining what their priorities are and how they see the world in their presidency. This is essential for us to understand what's going on, what's coming, and how to best deal with the legal acts that are supposed to come into our beloved agreement. Finally, we have a subcommittee 5, which takes care of more the legal and institutional matters. Also very close cooperation with our division, but less into the sort of everyday life of a legal act. But for sure, if there are any issues in this respect, it's essential for us to keep all the adjustments of the EU law so that it becomes the best possible, but also that we don't change it in a way that we need to also cater for legal certainty. So all the adaptations needs to be good and sound and solid and recognizable also for the future. Then we have the decision making. I'm not going to say too much about that, because again, one of my excellent colleagues, Olli Dagur-Vaittisson, will go through this later. But I will continue a bit with some numbers and key sectors. Since the incorporation of, or since the signing of the agreement, we have, at the time, we incorporated 1,875 acts when signing the agreement in '92. After that, we have incorporated something like 14,000 plus legal acts since the signing. That's quite substantial. And out of them, roughly 7,900 acts are in force today. The biggest area by far, and particularly last year, because they jumped by like 8%, 9%, is the food and veterinary area. 44% of all the acts incorporated last year. This ensures full compliance with EU rules on the food chain, frictionless export of seafood and agricultural goods. And it also means that we have no veterinary import or export controls, but we do have customs since we are not a part of the customs union. Other high volume sectors are financial services, transports and goods. And then we have some up and coming areas. And I mean, not only up and coming because they're already there. As you probably heard of, the European Green Deal, we have to make a green shift. We have to change our way of living and producing to ensure that we try and stop the environmental challenges that we are facing. We are talking about, or the environmental people are talking about a tsunami of acts that is going to facilitate this Green Deal, because it needs to be taken care of all over. The consumers needs to have regulations so it makes them able to actually make a green choice. Finances needs acts that make them be able to invest in a green way, and so on and so forth. And another challenge that we are also facing these days is acts with so-called distinct horizontal challenges. There again, we are fortunate to have another great colleague, Elisabeth, who will tell you a bit more about that and how that is impacting how we are thinking and doing within the framework of EEA at the moment. This is processing volumes and backlog. Backlog is a word that we hear a lot in this house. It makes, I mean, the EEA, we start incorporating legal acts into the agreement once the EU is already done, when they have decided how a legal act should, what it should look like. It means that a part of the legal acts, we will always be delayed because we start when they are done. Last year, we incorporated, let's see if I managed to, yep. I really wonder what has happened here, because maybe you don't have the right, okay, sorry about that. I'll tell you the right numbers. Don't look at these numbers. Well, actually you can. 789 acts we identified last year coming from the EU that we need to look at and assess if it should go into the agreement or not. 620, not of those acts that came last year, but in general, 620 acts were actually assessed and incorporated into the agreement last year. And there were 134 that we excluded because they are not a part of the framework of the agreement. This is quite a lot, and I have to say last year as well, out of those 620, quite a few of them were big, complicated, had been discussed between us and the EU side for many years. So the number is high already, but the complexity also makes this number, to us at least, quite impressive. Then I will round off by saying a few words about the EEA agreement in the Europe of today. Well, first of all, I would like to say that the agreement, and this is what we say all the time, it sounds like something we just say in nice occasions like this, but it's actually a fact. It remains robust and resilient, celebrating its 30 years. It is an excellent cooperation. 85% approximately of all the legal acts that we take into the agreement every year, we take in without any adaptations because they are clearly within the framework. They are acts, they are maybe changing acts that have already been in, or it doesn't need to be adjusted to EEA specific issues. And I mentioned the inherent delay. That is a part of the complexity, in addition to the fact that EU adopts more and more complex legislation. If you look over here, over there, you see that the EU is also, they produce much more legal acts than before. This is, of course, due to the situation we are in and the need for changes that they see. And yes, also the complexity and the fact that sometimes we have legal acts inside and outside the scope of the agreement means that we need to adapt their legislation to make it fit in. And we see what are then the challenges that we face in managing the EEA agreement. Well, some of the things is that the EU cooperation is broader and wider than the EEA cooperation. The scope, both the geographical and the substantial scope of the agreement, is fixed. That doesn't change, even if it's a dynamic agreement. Agencies is another topic. This was not catered for at all. In '94, the EU creates agencies to solve problems that arise, problems that are quite similar that we face, obviously, in our societies. So very often you see that the EFTA states wants to be a part of the agency. Our challenge is that I don't think one single of the agency is set up in the similar way. So we always have to create new solutions to make it fit into the agreement. And sometimes you also have discussions in member states, whether it's transfer of goods and so on, not goods, transfer of competence, for instance, to EU institutions that we cannot do. So we have to find other solutions for that. Finally, I just want to briefly mention the geopolitical situation that we are in. We have passed the pandemic. We are in the middle of wars, and there are political challenges on the trade side, for instance, US and China. All of these things we recognize and see in the development of new EU legislation. This means that we also have to think differently, because this way of thinking, for instance, I mean, the EEA agreement is mainly the 4 freedoms in the internal market. The EU is now regulating more and differently, basing the legal acts and using internal market legislation to solve those problems outside the scope of the EEA. Then we have to think and find the ways how to incorporate that and how to see whether that can be done in the framework of the agreement or whether it has to be done on the other side, and not to mention also how the EU sees us in this cooperation. So I think it's, in bottom line, I think it's important to say today that the EEA agreement and its framework remains the same. Its scope remains the same, but we have to think differently to tackle the future. We as EFTA states, and we as a Secretariat assisting our states in this matter. The agreement is there to ensure a well-functioning internal market. It's the responsibility of both parties, both the EEA-EFTA side and the EU, to actually find solutions to that. So it's not only on the EU-EFTA side and it's not only on the EU side. We have common responsibilities to make this agreement work. I think it works quite well. The humps and the bumps we are dealing along the way. And I think history is definitely proving that if there is something that we're able to find solutions even on things that doesn't really fit in to the agreement we made 30 years ago. Thank you. That was what I was going to say.